A film nobody in the industry expected to work was assembled for less than the catering budget of most studio pictures, shot in a city it openly lies about being set in, and handed to a cast almost nobody had heard of. Behind the toilet dive, the baby on the ceiling, and the choose life monologue sits a production held together by accidents, refusals, and cheap tricks that somehow read as genius. It made Ewan McGregor a star, rewrote what British cinema was permitted to sound like, and still wins Best Scottish Film Ever Made polls 30 years later. It started with one man, one paperback, and one very long flight. 1. He bought the rights at 30,000 feet. Most of publishing had quietly filed Irvine Welsh's novel under unfilmable. It had no plot in any conventional sense, just a scatter of vignettes, written in thick Scots dialect, that refused to organise themselves into anything resembling a three-act structure. Andrew MacDonald read it on a long-haul flight anyway, and somewhere over the clouds, he saw a film other people couldn't see. By the time the plane landed in late 1993, he'd decided to make it. Speed mattered as much as vision here. Welsh's book was gathering cult momentum fast enough that bigger buyers were starting to circle, so MacDonald moved to lock the rights before anyone with deeper pockets noticed what he'd noticed. He was betting real money on a story with no spine, trusting that the right team could build one from nothing. It helped that he'd inherited the instinct. MacDonald is the grandson of Emmerich Pressburger, half of the Powell and Pressburger partnership behind some of the most ambitious British cinema ever made. The hunch that a plotless paperback might become something extraordinary didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of the family. 2. The Shallow Grave Gang reunited, on purpose. After Shallow Grave landed as a sharp, nasty hit in 1994, Danny Boyle, Andrew MacDonald, and John Hodge could have gone almost anywhere. Bigger studios were calling, with bigger budgets attached and considerably less risk involved. They said no to all of it. Instead, they took roughly £1.5 million and went back to Scotland to adapt a plotless novel about heroin addiction in Leith, which was, by any sane calculation, the harder and riskier path. Small budget, brutal subject matter, no narrative scaffolding to lean on. What they had instead was each other. By their second film together, the trio already shared a creative shorthand, a way of agreeing fast and shooting faster, without burning money on hesitation. That continuity is a large part of why a film made for so little money feels so confident on screen. They'd already learned to trust each other before the cameras started rolling. 3. Boyle wanted repulsive, but charming. Unbearable was the word Ewan McGregor used to describe the thought of anyone else playing Renton. By the time cameras were ready to roll, he was so bound to the role that losing it would have genuinely wounded him, which is precisely the reaction Danny Boyle had spent months trying to provoke in his eventual audience. Boyle's instructions for the character were specific and a little perverse. He wanted the quality Michael Caine brought to Alfie and Malcolm McDowell brought to A Clockwork Orange, a man who should repel you, performed with enough charm that liking him anyway leaves you faintly disturbed. Renton steals from his friends, lies to everyone including himself, and wastes his own life in real time. The film only functions if the audience roots for him regardless. McGregor had effectively been the first choice from the beginning, on the strength of Shallow Grave alone, though Boyle played it carefully. Rather than make a formal offer, he simply handed McGregor the script at the Sundance Film Festival and let the material do the persuading. Once the role was his, McGregor pursued it with a thoroughness that surprised even the people who'd already decided to cast him. 4. Ewan McGregor starved himself for the part 2. Stone is roughly £28, and that's what Ewan McGregor stripped off his own frame to reach the gaunt, hollowed look of a man being consumed by addiction. He shaved his head as well. The combined effect is drastic enough that he becomes genuinely difficult to recognize inside his own film. His method for getting there was almost comically unglamorous. He grilled everything he ate. He gave up beer entirely and switched to wine and gin to keep the weight off. None of the immersive psychological preparation people typically associate with this kind of transformation. The work lived entirely on the outside, and that surface-level commitment did half the performance's work before McGregor spoke a single line. The body on screen matched the life the film was describing, which meant the audience believed the character before the dialogue had to convince them of anything. 5. Sick Boy was one with a Sean Connery impression. There's a particular irony in how the one Englishman in the main cast talked his way into a thoroughly Scottish ensemble. Johnny Lee Miller secured the role of Sick Boy partly by slipping into a note-perfect Sean Connery impression during his audition for Danny Boyle, the kind of party trick that doubles as proof you can convincingly carry a voice that isn't your own. Boyle had first noticed Miller in Hackers, of all things, playing an American, which made casting him as a sharp-tongued Edinburgh schemer a genuine leap of faith on accent alone. It paid off completely. Miller's Edinburgh patter holds up beside actors who'd grown up speaking it, and most viewers never guessed that the smoothest, most convincingly Scottish-sounding member of the group was the one person in it who had to fake the accent from scratch. 6. He studied real addicts to play one. On his days off in Luxembourg, where he was shooting The Pillow Book, Ewan McGregor would walk down to the railway station and simply watch. He studied the men and women caught in addiction around it, the slow economy of their movement, the particular way exhaustion sits in a body, and quietly folded what he saw into the physical language he'd later use in the film's opening sequence. The observation went further than passive watching. McGregor read extensively about the drugs the film was built around, and in Glasgow he sat down with the recovering addicts of the Carlton Athletic Recovery Group, who walked him through the grim mechanics of the habit and taught him to cook up using harmless glucose powder in place of anything real. He's since admitted he's seriously considered trying the drug himself to understand the experience from the inside before deciding against it. That refusal matters more than it might seem. Everything unsettling and authentic about the performance came from observation and craft rather than lived experience, which is precisely why it never tips into glamour. McGregor learned the surface of addiction so completely that audiences mistook it for the real thing. 7. Diane was cast off a flyer. Most of the cast arrived with stage or screen experience behind them. Kelly MacDonald had a waitressing job and zero acting experience when she picked up a small flyer being handed around at an open casting call and decided, more or less on a whim, to show up. She read for Diane. She got it. One of the film's most memorable roles became a complete debut. The math on this is its own small shock. MacDonald was 19 years old playing a character written as 14 or 15, and she carried the role with a poise that gives no hint of how new she actually was to any of it. For someone pulled off a flyer days earlier, she holds the screen against seasoned actors without ever looking out of her depth. One detail from the shoot has followed her ever since, told and retold with a wince. Not yet wise to how film sets actually work, she cheerfully invited her mother and brother to come watch on the exact day she was filming one of Diane's more adult scenes, and only realized, once they'd already arrived, precisely what they were about to witness. 8. Spud already knew this world from the stage. Part of his heritage is how Ewan Bremner described his connection to these characters, and he'd earned the phrase honestly. Before the film existed, Bremner had already played Renton, the lead role, in a stage production of Trainspotting. He arrived at the screen version already knowing this world from the inside. When the film cast him, he chose Spud instead of the role he'd carried on stage. It was a telling swap. Bremner turned the gangly, anxious, perpetually unlucky Spud into something tender and quietly devastating, all twitching hands and panicked eyes, and the performance became one of the most beloved things in the entire film. That kind of rootedness ran through the whole production. The people bringing Welsh's Leith to life had often spent years close to this material already, and it shows in how lived in every corner of the film feels. 9. The football team were real recovering addicts. In the breathless opening montage, with Renton and his friends sprinting down the road to Iggy Pop, a scrappy five-a-side football match plays out in the background. Look closely at the side losing, the players chasing the ball without much luck, and you're not watching actors, you're watching members of a real Glasgow recovery community, men who had come through addiction themselves and agreed to stand in front of the camera. They came from Carlton Athletic, a recovery group whose involvement ran far deeper than a few background faces. The organization had built its entire approach around getting and staying clean without substitute prescriptions, and it took a firm public stance against methadone, the substitute treatment that was standard policy at the time. That conviction gave the production something money cannot buy: people who knew exactly what the film was depicting and would not let it ring false. One of their number, a supervisor named Eamon, worked closely with the team to keep the drug scenes honest, down to small physical details an outsider would never have gotten right. The effect of all this is strange to sit with. A film that critics worried might glamorize addiction was being quietly kept truthful by the very people who had fought their way out of it. The line between a real recovery movement and a fictional story about addiction gets genuinely blurry here, and the film is more credible for it. 10. Begbie was almost a completely different actor. Robert Carlyle's Begbie is so welded to the film now that it's easy to forget Danny Boyle wanted someone else first. His original choice was Christopher Eccleston, years before Eccleston became Doctor Who, largely because Eccleston physically matched the hulking, bull-necked brawler Welsh had written on the page. Boyle changed course and handed the role to Carlyle, who has built nothing like that description, and the menace shifted entirely, from sheer physical size to something coiled and unpredictable. A smaller man you sense could detonate at any second. It's one of the great what-ifs of 90s British casting. Picture a bigger, more obviously threatening Begbie looming over those same scenes, and the entire temperature of the film starts to feel different. Would it have frightened audiences the same way? Or is it specifically Carlyle's live-wire stillness that makes the character impossible to look away from? 11. The worst toilet in Scotland was made of chocolate. On screen it reads as one of the most repulsive moments in 90s cinema, and yet the water Renton lowers himself into is suspiciously, almost serenely clean. That contradiction between the filthiest setting in the film and the clear blue pool beneath it has a far more practical explanation than the symbolism critics later draped over it. The scene sends Renton headfirst into the self-styled worst toilet in Scotland to retrieve 2 suppositories holding the last of his stash, and then, in a flourish of pure cinema, down into a vast, calm underwater world. The grime caked around the bowl was easy to fake. The crew built it out of chocolate, which by several accounts smelled genuinely pleasant on set, an odd mercy for everyone who had to spend hours near it. The pristine water, on the other hand, was an accident. The plan had been to dirty the pool, but the location's owners refused, unwilling to absorb the cost of draining and refilling it afterward. So the crew shot it clean and hoped for the best. What happened next is the kind of luck the entire production seemed to run on. Reviewers read deep symbolism into that shift from squalor to clear water. Baptism, a plunge into another reality, and a fair amount of it was never planned at all. Boyle leaned into the surreal register here in a way that openly nods to A Nightmare on Elm Street, turning a budget compromise into one of the film's most iconic images. 12. Boyle assigned the cast film homework. Before a single frame was shot, the actors were handed a viewing list. Danny Boyle wanted them steeped in a specific cinematic lineage, stories of rebels and desperate men, and he set them to watching A Clockwork Orange, The Hustler, Goodfellas, and The Exorcist, so that everyone arrived speaking the same visual language. The choices were deliberate, not random. A Clockwork Orange supplied stylized menace and swagger. Goodfellas lent its restless, propulsive editing that never sits still. The Exorcist gave Boyle license to drop sudden bursts of real horror into an otherwise grounded story. You can feel all 3 influences in the finished film, in the way a comic scene can lurch into nightmare without warning. This was Boyle solving a practical problem on a brutally tight schedule, with a cast still finding their footing together. Rather than explain the tone he wanted in notes and meetings, he gave them a shared set of references to absorb, so that when cameras finally rolled, the energy he was after was already in the room. 13. Carlyle built a secret into Begbie. The most frightening man in the film was, in the actor's own mind, also the most frightened. Robert Carlyle has said he played Begbie as a closeted gay man, and that the volcanic, unprovoked violence functioned as armor for someone terrified of being discovered. Sit with that for a moment, and the entire performance reorganizes itself. The fight-picking, the contempt, the compulsive need to dominate every room he enters, all of it starts to look less like simple thuggery and more like a man at war with himself. Crucially, this reading wasn't an actor's private invention layered on after the fact. Irvine Welsh, who created Begbie, has confirmed he always intended the character's sexuality to be ambiguous, and he agreed with Carlyle's interpretation outright. Everything the actor brought to the surface was already waiting inside the role for someone willing to see it. Carlyle could barely watch the result. At the test screening, by his own account, he sank lower in his seat every time Begbie appeared on screen, as if trying to disappear from his own performance. He has since described the role as a portrait of a man deep in the closet, lashing out at a world he was terrified might one day see him clearly. 14. Renton sank through an actual trap door. There's a moment, scored to the aching calm of Lou Reed's Perfect Day, where Renton seems to sink bodily into a deep red carpet, swallowed by the floor as the drug takes him under. It reads as an expensive visual effect. It cost almost nothing. The crew built a small platform over a literal trapdoor, positioned McGregor on top of it, and lowered him slowly through the gap, while the camera held perfectly still, so the actor really did descend out of frame and into the carpet. The scene plays as one of the film's most haunting images, the red of the floor closing over him like water, and it stands as a neat little monument to how often this production reached for a hammer and some plywood, where a bigger film would have reached straight for its wallet. 15. The entire film was shot in 7 weeks. Headquarters for one of the decade's most influential British productions was a disused cigarette factory in Glasgow. Out of that cavernous, run-down building, the team turned around the entire shoot in mid-1995 in roughly 7 weeks, somewhere near 35 days, on a budget of about £1.5 million. That pace left no room for second-guessing. With so little money and so little time, most scenes were captured in a single take, and that necessity is woven directly into the film's visual texture. The rawness people praise, the grungy, caught-on-the-hoof energy, is partly just the byproduct of a crew that couldn't afford to do anything twice. The schedule was punishing on the people involved as well. By most accounts, McGregor had a single day off across the entire production. Those constraints became the style. They pressed the film into the urgent, restless shape that became its signature, the kind of edge a more comfortable budget might well have sanded smooth. 16. That injecting arm wasn't real. In the film's most uncomfortable close-ups, the limb you're watching doesn't belong to Ewan McGregor. The makeup department built a prosthetic for those few seconds, and they built it with genuine care, molding veins that seemed to pulse, weathered marks tracking up the skin, tiny hidden pockets of fake blood that welled up the instant the needle made contact. It meant the camera could linger on the act in queasy detail while nobody on set was anywhere near actual danger. There's something telling in how much craft went into a shot that lasts barely a moment. A sculpted, blood-rigged forearm, built so that a few seconds of footage would make an entire audience wince. "17. The colors came straight from Francis Bacon. For all its lurching, kinetic chaos, the film holds to a visual scheme as disciplined as anything hung in a gallery. Underneath the speed and squalor sits a deliberate order, and its origins lie on the walls of art museums, rather than in a cinematographer's standard toolkit. Boyle and his team took the palette of painter Francis Bacon as their starting point, pulling the addict's world toward Bacon's muted reds, oranges and bruised purples, those colors of flesh and unease. Then they coded the entire film by hand. Red runs through moments of drugs and danger. Green attaches itself to healing and safety. The in-between, transitional spaces are washed in blue. Once you know the system, a film that feels improvised on the surface reveals a quiet rigor underneath it. The chaos was always conducted. Every shift in color is doing a job, steering how a scene should feel before a single word of dialogue tells you, and it's one of the clearest signs of how much control sat behind the apparent mess. 18. The ceiling baby hit a far nastier original idea. It's the image people still flinch at decades later. An infant crawling overhead in the dead of a withdrawal, then rotating its head to fix Renton, with a stare lifted straight from The Exorcist. The scene is the hinge of the entire film, the point where the giddy rush of the early stretch curdles into genuine horror, and it still has the power to make a full room go silent. There was no digital trickery involved. The whole nightmare was staged the old-fashioned way, with a physical model of baby Dawn built and rigged to crawl and turn, which somehow makes it worse. There's a tactile, in-the-room wrongness to a real object moving in a real space that pure computer effects rarely match. Boyle understood that something physically present in a physical room unsettles an audience at a deeper level than anything rendered. The novel was crueler still. As disturbing as the moment is on screen, Welsh's book went further, giving the hallucinated baby vampire teeth, and worse than any of it, the power to speak. The film stops short of that final indignity. What it leaves you with instead is a single twist of a tiny head, held just long enough to crawl under your skin and stay there. 19. Edinburgh's story, filmed entirely in Glasgow. The city this film so vividly belongs to is barely the city it was actually shot in. Trainspotting lives and breathes Edinburgh. Its slang, its streets, its entire sense of place. Yet almost every frame was captured 40 miles west, in Glasgow. That abandoned cigarette factory did most of the heavy lifting, redressed and relit, to stand in for roughly 30 different locations. An entire fictional Edinburgh, conjured inside one Glaswegian shell. Only a single sequence was genuinely shot where the story is set. the opening burst of shoplifting, and the chase down Prince's Street. For a film this rooted in one specific place, it's a small marvel that the place on screen is mostly a stand-in, and that almost nobody watching has ever noticed the seam. 20. The soundtrack outlived the film that made it. Years after release, music magazines were still ranking it among the greatest soundtracks ever assembled for the screen, with both Vanity Fair and Rolling Stone placing it near the very top of the form. That's rare company for any record, let alone one stitched together for a low-budget British film about addiction. Part of the power was in the bookending. Iggy Pop's Lust for Life kicks the whole thing off, its famous drum intro hammering under the opening sprint down Prince's Street, pure adrenaline before a single word is spoken. At the other end, Underworld's Born Slippy carries Renton out of the story and into whatever comes next, a swelling electronic anthem that went on to become a colossal hit in its own right, lifted into the charts on the back of the film. For an entire generation of listeners, the track is now inseparable from that final image of a man walking away. What the album really captured was a precise moment in time. Its collision of guitar-driven Britpop and surging electronic music caught Britain in 1996, right at a cultural turning point. The old and the new, shoving against each other inside the same 45 minutes. That's why the soundtrack has outlasted so much around it. For an entire generation, it sits exactly level with the film itself. Every bit is remembered, every bit is played. A record that became a piece of the decade, rather than a souvenir of one movie. 21. The source novel was cut to the bone. The job of turning that scattered, plotless novel into a film fell to John Hodge, and the scale of what he removed is half the story. The book Andrew MacDonald had fallen for on a plane was a sprawl of voices and episodes with no spine to speak of, and Hodge's task was to find a film hiding inside it without betraying what made it sing in the first place. His solution was ruthless. Entire storylines and characters from Welsh's pages were dropped or folded into one another. Everything bent toward a single clear line audiences could actually follow, with Renton anchoring the center. The 90 minutes that survived are lean precisely because so much was sacrificed to get there. Hodge arrived at this work by an unusual road. He had trained and practiced as a doctor before he ever wrote a screenplay, not the typical apprenticeship for adapting a cult novel. The gamble that a so-called unfilmable book could be tamed paid off completely, earning the adaptation's serious acclaim and major awards attention. Keeping the author's blessing through all that cutting mattered too, because Welsh himself was about to step in front of the camera. 22. The author plays the drug dealer. Watch the small-time supplier who sets the entire toilet sequence in motion, because the man playing him wrote the book the film is based on. Irvine Welsh appears in his own adaptation as Mikey Forrester, the dealer who hands Renton the suppositories that send him diving into the worst toilet in Scotland. There's a lovely circularity to it, the novelist appearing on screen to personally pass along the very object that drives one of his most famous scenes, the creator handing his creation the spark for the chaos. It also says something about how closely Welsh stood to the production. A cult author can be precious and guarded about an adaptation of his work. Instead, he climbed inside it and joined in. Catch it on a rewatch, and the cameo becomes one of the film's warmest in-jokes. 23. America got a quietly softened opening reel. Two audiences watched what they assumed was the same opening, and they weren't quite hearing the same film. For its American release, distributor Miramax went back and re-recorded roughly the first 20 minutes of dialogue, easing the thick Edinburgh accents and dense Scots slang into something softer and clearer for ears on the other side of the Atlantic. The reasoning was straightforward. There was real concern that US viewers would lose the thread entirely in those crucial early scenes, where the film's rhythm and vocabulary are at their most uncompromising, and that confusion in the first reel could sink the entire picture for them. So the voices were gentled, just long enough to let audiences find their footing, before the original soundtrack took back over. It's a small change with a surprisingly large implication. The first taste many Americans got of this defiantly Scottish film had been quietly sanded down for them. You have to wonder what was lost in the smoothing. Does a story this rooted in the particular music of a place survive being made easier to understand? Or does some of its bite live in the very words an outsider has to strain to follow? 24. Oasis turned it down over a misunderstanding. One of the biggest bands in Britain rejected a spot on the soundtrack over a complete misreading of what the film actually was. When Danny Boyle approached Oasis for a song, Noel Gallagher said no, having somehow concluded the movie was, literally, about men who stand on train platforms writing down the numbers of passing locomotives. He thought it was a film about a hobby. The real origin of the title is far stranger and considerably sadder. It comes from a scene in Welsh's novel set in a disused railway station in Leith, where Begbie's estranged, down-and-out father turns to the group and asks if they're train-spotting among the rotting platforms and torn-up lines. There's a bleak joke buried in it, the idea of spotting trains in a station where the trains no longer run, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with the actual plot of drugs and friendship the film tells. Gallagher, as it turns out, wasn't the only one left puzzled by the name. He may simply be the only one whose confusion cost him a place on one of the decade's defining records. 25. American censors cut Diane's big moment. A film soaked in needles and savage violence sailed past American censors, largely intact, and then they reached for the scissors over a few seconds involving a teenager and a smile. The cut made for the United States release trimmed a brief moment from the scene between Renton and Diane, and the stated objection was specifically that the young character appeared to be enjoying it a little too much. Ewan McGregor was not impressed, and he said so publicly. His point was simple and difficult to argue with. The film had been allowed to depict drug use and brutal violence in unflinching detail, and yet this small beat was deemed a step too far, which told you a great deal about exactly where the line was being drawn and why. It's a neat little window into the double standards of the moment. Graphic self-destruction was apparently watchable. A few seconds of a young character's visible enjoyment were not. What exactly were the censors shielding audiences from, and what does it say that the harm on screen unsettled them far less than the happiness did? 26. The orange poster broke every rule of film advertising. A searing block of industrial orange, severe black and white portraits, and clean Helvetica lettering stacked like a track listing. The campaign looked more like a record sleeve or a hazard sign than a film advert. The blazing orange was entirely deliberate. The design agency Styler Rouge set out to ignore the conventions of movie advertising altogether, and the now iconic look came from Mark Blameyer, for whom this was his first film poster. Alongside the in-character images of the cast came a separate piece that took on a life entirely of its own. The stark text poster carrying the Choose Life monologue. It's been parodied so many times and stayed in print for so long that it has drifted free of the film completely, a slogan people recognize even when they've never seen a single frame of the movie it came from. None of this was cheap or accidental. Distributor Polygram put serious money behind it, somewhere around £800,000, selling the picture as a kind of British answer to Pulp Fiction. All attitude, danger, and cool. For a small Scottish film about addiction, that was an audacious sum to spend convincing the world it was the coolest thing currently in cinemas. 27. Scotland's finest film, decades later. By now the film sits high on the British Film Institute's roll of the country's greatest pictures, and one national public poll has crowned it the best film ever made north of the border. That's no small claim for a low-budget feature once dismissed in some quarters as a glorified drugs movie, and the verdict has only hardened with time. Careers were made here. The picture launched Ewan McGregor towards stardom, put Robert Carlyle, Johnny Lee Miller, and Kelly MacDonald firmly on the map, and confirmed Danny Boyle as a major filmmaking talent rather than a one-hit director. A remarkable amount of British screen success across the following decades traces back to this single 7-week shoot. Boyle understood exactly what he had, and he was patient with it. When the time came for a sequel, he deliberately let roughly 20 years pass before making T2 Trainspotting, partly so the original actors would carry real, visible age into their returning roles. Getting an entire principal cast back together 2 decades later is rare enough on its own. It gave the follow-up a weight that money could never have purchased. 28. A tiny budget, a staggering payday. Multiply the cost by roughly 50, and you get somewhere near what this film actually earned. A picture made for around £1.5 million went on to take in the region of £48 million worldwide, comfortably over $70 million, the kind of return most studios spend their entire existence chasing, and almost never see. At home, it went straight to #1 and stayed a genuine cultural event for months. The film everyone seemed to have an opinion on, whether or not they'd actually seen it. In the United States, it never aimed for blanket saturation, playing instead as a strong, limited release that built on word of mouth and a wave of curiosity about this loud, strange thing coming out of Scotland. There was even a snub that worked in its favor, The film screened at the 1996 Cannes Film Festival, but was reportedly held out of the main competition because of its difficult subject matter, kept at arm's length by the official selection. It hardly mattered. It became one of the most talked about titles of the entire festival regardless. Step back, and the scale of it is almost comic. A regional British indie about addiction, shot in 7 weeks inside a derelict factory, turned itself into a global phenomenon and returned 50 times what it cost. Very few films of any size, made anywhere, ever pull that off. 29. A US senator attacked it without watching it. There's a particular kind of fury reserved for things people haven't actually seen, and this film attracted a famous example of it. In the heat of the 1996 United States presidential race, candidate Bob Dole publicly denounced the picture, naming it alongside Pulp Fiction as proof of a culture glorifying hard drugs and moral decline. The sort of film he argued was poisoning the country. Then came the deflating twist. Dole's own press secretary later acknowledged that the candidate had not, in fact, watched the film he was condemning. The attack had been built entirely on its reputation and its reviews, on the idea of the thing rather than the thing itself, which is a remarkable way to go to war with a movie. What's striking is how completely the outrage backfired. For a film already trading on danger and cool, a national stage condemnation from an establishment politician played as a gift. A free advertisement stamped with exactly the disapproval its young audience found irresistible. The controversy only burnished the legend further. There's an irony worth sitting with as the credits roll. The loudest public attempt to bury this film may have done more to keep it alive than anything its own makers could have dreamed up, which leaves you wondering which version of Trainspotting the world would remember today, if nobody powerful had ever bothered to be frightened of it. A cheap, fast, regional film about addiction had no real business becoming one of the defining works of its decade, and yet that's exactly what Trainspotting did, and it has never once lost its charge. The energy, the honesty, the flat refusal to either preach at you or dress any of it up as glamour are why people are still arguing about it 30 years on. If you've enjoyed going behind the scenes with me, subscribe and stick around, because I dig into a film like this one every single week. I'd love to know which of these secrets caught you most off guard. Tell me down in the comments. And while you're there, drop me the title of the film you think I should pull apart next.